Snow fell that night the way forgotten prayers return, soft at first, then relentless, until the land itself seemed to bow beneath their weight. It swallowed the road, erased the horizon, and wrapped the mountains in a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Nyati Crowar stood outside his cabin with his coat pulled tight around his ribs, watching his breath bloom and vanish in the cold. 30 years had taught him how to endure, but not how to belong. He lived alone because solitude asked fewer questions, because the land never judged the shape of his quiet. Yet that night, as the storm clawed at the logs and the dark pressed closer, he felt the old ache rise again, the one that reminded him he was still human, still capable of wanting something more than survival. He did not know then that the storm was not there to bury him, but to deliver him a beginning. He noticed her first as motion, a fragile defiance cutting through the white void. At first, he thought it was only the wind shaping tricks out of snow. But then the shape moved again, steady, deliberate, human. A woman walked alone through the storm, her body bent forward, not in weakness, but in calculation, each step chosen with care. She carried a small bundle clutched against her chest, wrapped in worn cloth, as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. Something stirred in Nyat's chest, sharp and unfamiliar. Before he could weigh the risk or remember his reasons for staying closed, his voice escaped him. "Get into my cabin," he called out, the words torn rough by the wind. "It's freezing outside." The sentence hovered between them, fragile as glass, and the storm seemed to pause, waiting to see whether she would trust it. Her name was Nokomi's Red Willow, though he would learn it much later. In that moment, she was only a woman who had learned early that kindness often came disguised as obligation. At 21, she carried herself with the caution of someone far older, her dark eyes sharp with survival, her spine straight with pride that refused to break. The world had taught her to measure warmth carefully, to count the cost before accepting it. She studied Nyati's face, the distance he kept, the way his hands remained open and empty. After a long moment, she nodded once. Not trust, never that, but necessity. When she crossed the threshold, the door closed behind her with a sound that felt heavier than wood, as though something unseen had sealed itself shut. The cabin was small, weathered by years of wind and silence. Pine smoke lingered in the air, and the fire in the hearth cracked softly, alive with its own restless breath. Nokomi stayed near the door at first, her body angled for escape, while Nyati turned away to tend the kettle, giving her the kind of space that did not demand gratitude. He set a tin cup of hot coffee on the table and slid it toward her without ceremony. It was not an offer, not a favor, just a fact that unsettled her more than warmth ever could. As she wrapped her hands around the cup, the firelight caught the edge of her bundle, and small pieces of metal glimmered faintly. Earlier that day, the town had reminded Nokomi's who believed her to be. She had stood near the saloon, laying out her jewelry on a wooden crate. Necklaces and bracelets shaped from broken watch gears, bent springs, discarded fragments of motion that others had thrown away. The pieces clinked softly as she arranged them, but no one stopped. Eyes slid past her as if she were weather. Inconvenient, unavoidable, unworthy of notice. A man laughed without humor and muttered something about girls who sold trinkets to hide their emptiness. Nokomis folded her cloth with steady hands, refusing to let his words decide her worth. Nyati had been there too, hat pulled low, choosing distance over decency. He had told himself it was safer not to be seen. The memory burned now as he watched her sit by his fire, and shame crept into him quietly, the way it always does when it arrives too late. The storm did not ease, and neither did the silence between them. Nokomi eventually opened her bundle and began repairing a broken necklace, her fingers moving with practiced patience. She worked the way someone does when they trust process more than promises, shaping beauty from damage without complaint. Nyati split wood, then split it again, letting the rhythm anchor his thoughts. They spoke in fragments about the cold, about roads that stayed open when others closed, about how winter teaches you what you truly need. Each sentence was placed carefully, tested for weight, ready to be withdrawn if it threatened something fragile. There were no confessions, no sudden truths, only the growing realization that neither of them was being asked to disappear. Days passed. Snow piled against the windows until the cabin felt like the center of the world. Nokomi stayed not because she was asked, but because the storm insisted and the space allowed it. She swept the floor each morning, not to earn her place, but to mark it. Nayati learned to share his table without counting what he might lose. He watched her hum while she worked, a low sound that filled corners he had forgotten existed, and she watched him mend tools with a care that surprised even him. The town faded into a distant memory during those days, its judgment softened by distance and snow. Something inside Nayati began to loosen, as if a long-held breath were finally being released. That night, they sat by the fire, not touching, not avoiding, simply existing in the same quiet. Nkome spoke once of her mother, of learning to work metal from scraps, because scraps were all they ever had. Nayati spoke of horses and storms, and the relief of a door that closed at night. Their stories did not overlap, but they leaned toward each other, drawn by the shared understanding of what it meant to endure. In those moments, something fragile began to take root. Not love, not yet, but recognition. And recognition, when it arrives after a lifetime of being unseen, can feel like salvation. When the storm finally broke, the world emerged sharp and unforgiving in its beauty. The snow glittered under a pale sun, and the road reappeared like a question waiting to be answered. Nokomi packed her bundle with practiced ease, not rushing, not lingering. Nayati felt the old fear rise, the one that whispered that all warmth ends, that solitude always collects its due. He walked with her toward the road, snow crunching beneath their boots, the town waiting beyond the white fields, unchanged and expectant. He did not ask her to stay because he had learned that love spoken too soon can sound like a cage. Instead, he asked where she wished to go. Nokomi stopped and looked at him, really looked, and in her eyes was neither gratitude nor challenge, only choice. Here, she said softly. The words settled between them like a vow, neither hurried to name. Spring arrived slowly, as it does in places that remember hardship. Nokomi's returned to the town with her jewelry, this time with Nayati beside her, not shielding her, not claiming her, simply standing where judgment could see him. The town adjusted the way it always does, slowly, reluctantly, then all at once. Coins began to fall into her hands with less hesitation. Nayati built a small workbench by the window, and together they shaped metal and wood, their movements learning each other without instruction. It was not a loud happiness, but it endured, and in endurance they found dignity. They married in early summer, quietly without spectacle, a simple ceremony near the creek, the land as witness. Nokomi wore a necklace of her own making. Motion turned into stillness. Nayat's hands trembled as he placed a ring that carried no weight but meaning. There were no cheers, no audience, only water moving over stone and wine through grass. That was enough. Marriage did not change who they were, but it named what they had chosen. Each day after that became an act of choosing again. Years later, when I think of that winter, I remember not the storm, but the door, how it opened and how it stayed open. I remember two people who had learned shame before they learned kindness, choosing warmth without asking permission from the world. If there is a lesson in their story, it is this: dignity is not given. It is built quietly by those who refuse to disappear. And perhaps even now you are standing in the cold, wondering whether to knock, unaware that on the other side, a fire is still burning, waiting for someone brave enough to step inside.